This work is released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike license. This license allows you to remix, tweak and build upon this work non-commercially as long as you credit the authors and license your new creations under the identical Creative Commons license terms. Hello, my name is Dr. Debbie Custance, and this is a tutorial on writing intended learning outcomes. I've had lots of experience with intended learning outcomes. I've been teaching psychology in universities for 22 years, and for 6 years I was a member of Goldsmith's Programme Scrutiny Subcommittee, which involves looking at lots and lots of intended learning outcomes. Similarly, for 4 years I acted as an external examiner. So I must have over the years written and read thousands upon thousands of intended learning outcomes, and what I've learnt is, for the most part, academics write pretty terrible intended learning outcomes. So for this tutorial, the intended learning outcome is that on successful completion of this session by applying the principles discussed and completing the practical exercises, you'll be able to identify and write clear and comprehensible intended learning outcomes. So what are intended learning outcomes? Well, they state what a student should be able to do in order to demonstrate that they have actually successfully achieved the learning that was intended for a course of study. And in that sense, they are measurable, achievable, and accessible. Which of these do you think is an intended learning outcome? During this course, we will explore Homer's Odyssey. On successful completion of this course, you'll be able to recite all of Homer's Odyssey. Well, probably the second statement is more of a learning outcome than the first one. It's certainly measurable and accessible, and the first one isn't really talking about what the learning will be after a certain period of study, while the second one is. The question about the second one is it really achievable? Here's a more achievable intended learning outcome. On successful completion of this course, you will be able to provide a detailed oral synopsis of Homer's Odyssey. That is much more successful as an intended learning outcome. But why should we bother? Aren't they just rather pointless bureaucratic exercises? Well, I hope to show that they're anything but pointless. In fact, they sometimes can come under very intense scrutiny. This is because they form a kind of contract with our students, so that if on failing a programme of study, a student were to complain and appeal and say, well, it's not my fault, it's my tutor's, the tutor didn't teach me properly, I wasn't taught what I was expected, or I wasn't assessed in the way that I expected, then if it's found that the intended learning outcome are misaligned to the teaching methods and assessment, then the appeal is very likely to be upheld. But really this is all rather overly litigious. There are indeed higher pedagogical reasons why you would want to write good learning outcomes. That's because good intended learning outcomes can help your students. It can guide them in their learning, and that these intended learning outcomes explain what's expected of the students. As the old adage goes, you can't hit a target unless you know what it is, and intended learning outcomes help make clear to the students what the target is, the goals of a programme or course of study. Of course, they can also help tutors and lecturers and teachers, because they help us when we're designing units of studies to focus on exactly what we want the students to achieve, and then from that we can start to decide how we're going to teach it and what's the best way to assess it. And as such, they are an integral component of learning design in the sense of Biggs's term or construct of constructive alignment. Let me explain this point a little further. In learning design, you often have the teacher's intentions, the assessments, and then the student's activity. And at university level, teachers want a rather high level of cognitive engagement and sophistication so that students are able to explain, relate, prove, apply. But sometimes there's a misalignment between the intention of the teacher and the assessment that's set, that in fact all the assessment really requires the students to do is to memorise and describe. So the students can be forgiven for doing that. But there's a misalignment between the teacher's intentions and the student's activity. And certainly, if the teacher then grades or marks the students down, then both parties are going to end up being unhappy. So how do we put this right? How do we come up with a learning design where the intended learning outcomes, the method of teaching and the assessments are all nicely aligned? Well, teachers usually start with an aspiration or aim. I've heard many of my colleagues saying things along the lines of, I don't want my students to passively parrot things back to me. I want them to think for themselves. I want them to go out there and find the literature, particularly the most recent cutting-edge, exciting things, for themselves, and then to be able to think about it and offer their own systematic critical analysis of it. Well, that's a very fine aspiration, but how do you actually go about getting your students to do that? Well, one way is to change this teacher-centred aim into a student-directed intended learning outcome. Here's a very similar version of what I've just talked about, but now expressed as an intended learning outcome for a master's in cognitive neuroscience. On successful completion of this program of study, you will be able to independently locate and critically evaluate cutting-edge theory and research in the field of cognitive neuroscience. That's all very well, but how do we align the teaching to this? If we just do a standard series of lectures, then we're really encouraging our students to just passively receive the information and parrot it back. One way you might avoid doing this is to set up a weekly journal club where the students are required to go out there, find recent research, share it with each other, and then in this setting engage in peer critical evaluations of the research, perhaps facilitated by the lecturer or teacher. And then the next example is a piece of assessment that would align nicely to this. So what the teacher could set as a piece of assessed work is write a 5,000 word critical review on some aspect of cognitive neuroscience in which important advances have been made in recent years. I hope you can see how the original intended learning outcome, the teaching method and the assessment here are all nicely aligned. Now don't forget in all of this to actually explicitly discuss your thinking behind the learning design with your students. It's very important that you actually present the intended learning outcomes to them and discuss what you mean by them, unpack them for the students. Also make them easily available so the students can refer to them. You might put it on your virtual learning environment, in handbooks, and you might even attach them to assignment or assessment instructions. Well, what features characterise good intended learning outcomes? What do you think? Pause the film and go and get a piece of paper and a pen and brainstorm what you think are the features that characterise good ILOs. I've given one example here. Once you've made a list of a few points, then unpause the film and see the list that I've constructed. Well, here's my list. Pause the film again and compare my items here with the ones that you made on your list. Intended learning outcomes should contain, for the most part, explicit learning verbs. Verbs such as demonstrate, analyse, describe, evaluate, assess. What you should do is try and avoid what are called implicit learning phrases. Things like an appreciation for, an awareness of, being conscious of, developing an appreciation or knowledge of. All of these really refer to processes or products that are much more private to the learner and are difficult to assess and measure. Well, let's give you a few intended learning outcomes and critically evaluate them for yourselves. Here's one. By the end of this module, students will have developed an appreciation of contemporary feminist poets. Pause the film, have a little think about how you would evaluate this as an ILO, then unpause the film to see and hear my thoughts. Well, the problem here is the phrase developing an appreciation. This is relatively private to the learner, as we've just mentioned. Here's another one. On successful completion of this module, students will be able to apply APA conventions to their written work so that it contains no more than minor citation errors. Pause the film, think about what you think about this, and then unpause it to hear my thoughts. Well, this does explain what the students will be able to do, and it even stipulates a standard. Nonetheless, the tutor really should discuss this through with the students. For example, they may not know what APA means, American Psychological Association, but more importantly, they may not really understand what's taken to be minor citation errors. And during the course of study, this should be made explicit to the students. There is a basic structure that most intended learning outcomes follow in general. One is that there'll be a STEM statement, there'll be some kind of indication of the behaviour involved, of what the student will do, the context in which the student will demonstrate their learning, and the criteria by which they'll be evaluated. So for the intended learning outcome for this tutorial, the STEM was the section that said on successful completion of this session. The context is applying the principles discussed and completing the practical exercises. The behaviour will be you being able to identify and write intended learning outcomes, and the criteria is that these will be clear and comprehensible. Well, have a go at it yourself. Take a moment to write an intended learning outcome for a weekend course on how to ride a bicycle for absolute beginners. Pause the film, get a pen and paper, and write the ILO for this particular course. Well, this is my attempt. On successful completion of this 2-day practical course, you'll be able to ride a bicycle along a straight, flat, 100-metre long and 1-metre wide path without putting your feet down or falling off. You can see that this is measurable, hopefully it will be achievable, and that it will be accessible. You have to make sure that you pitch your learning outcomes to the right level of study. You will write different learning outcomes for an undergraduate versus master's versus PhD. Bloom's taxonomy can help with this. Here's his taxonomy. It's easily available online. There are in this hierarchy verbs that relate to increasingly more complex, cognitively challenging levels of study. So to begin with, these verbs describe things that are just requiring recall, then requiring slightly more sophistication with interpretation, and the most sophisticated of all, problem solving. You can use these verbs to help guide you when you're trying to write your intended learning outcomes. You can also use the Framework for Higher Education Qualifications 2008 publication, which again is easily available online, because this provides very helpful level descriptors that can help you in constructing your intended learning outcomes. I haven't covered everything that you can learn in relation to intended learning outcomes. If you have to write program specifications, then you'll be required to write program level intended learning outcomes. And it's a tricky business aligning these with module level or course level intended learning outcomes, which are really the learning outcomes that I've discussed throughout this tutorial. Another area I've not touched on is curriculum mapping. These are really the subjects for more advanced tutorials. Nonetheless, I hope that this particular tutorial has helped in getting you started in writing clear and comprehensible intended learning outcomes.